Hello, welcome to lecture 9 of our class series. We're still talking about the spread of Buddhism around the Great Circle. And in this lecture, we're going to look at the great so-called monuments of Buddhism and try to determine a method for studying them. I think that drawing the great circle of Buddhism and the pre-1500 history of the Buddhist tradition as it spread far and wide in the southeast corner of Eurasia left me with so many questions as to how did it spread and survive. When you send somebody thousands of miles away to start a center, how do you, in those days, how do you keep in touch? How do you maintain the authenticity of your tradition as it spreads? And perhaps spreads so that there is no immediate contact with a home base. What do you do with a religious system like Buddhism in the Great Circle that basically has no home base? So I'm going to look at some of the monuments and discuss them, and then try to share with you my idea about a model for studying them that we have not used before, or at least I have never used it before. I think one of the great monuments of the Buddhist tradition, as always, has to be Nalanda. Nalanda was an area where we believe the disciple of the Buddha, Shariputra, was born. And so from the very beginning of the movement, there would have been ties to this place. And over the years, this, like the other great monuments I'm going to show in this slide, in this lecture, developed into a huge campus-like complex with dozens of classrooms, if you could call them that, and I guess that's what they were, living quarters, a settlement. But one of the problems that has come up about the study of places like Nalanda is that today scholars are raising a question, and they're saying, we study these places in a way like something that you place in a museum case when you make an exhibit. We look at these places as if they are standing alone. We see them as just a monastery, just a place where monks gathered. But in fact, all of the ones that I'm going to show you in the lecture, all of these places were part of settlements. There were many people around these monuments who lived in complete harmony with the monument, if you will. But we don't tend to look at those, or haven't in the past, And now we're beginning to think about it. So Nalanda. Nalanda, when Xuanzang, a famous Chinese pilgrim, went there, he reported that there were 200 villages surrounding Nalanda that were owned by it. And part of the crops and that were brought to fruition by those villages went to support the place. I think this was the way of support for these great monuments. It was not a hit or miss situation of hoping you would have enough donations that would come in from people who come to visit. These were living quarters where you had to put the meals out every day. You had all these people who were dependent on it for their clothing, their food, their housing. The budget was enormous. You had thousands, hundreds in each of these great centers. How were they to be supported? Well, one of the issues was that land owning was such that if you owned land, on that land might be a village of people. So you owned the village in the sense that you owned the property on which the village was built. And the people who lived in that village were required to share their income with you. And that's how these large centers, I think, were primarily supported, not so much by donations from kings, although they had that, not just donations from merchants, they had that, but the donations often took the form of buying up the land around the monument with its villages and donating that to the monastery rather than making some kind of cash or gold coin offerings when you visit. So Nalanda is our first one that we look at today. Up in the northwest was Takshila. Takshila was a very old place in terms of the Buddhist tradition. It was on the route leading out of up the Ganges, leading up from the river into the mountains in the northwest, the Indus. And Takshila was a very cosmopolitan place because it was merchants from the so-called Silk Road, merchants who were tied to the seaports. They all were transcending this area. So Takshila here, they have discovered, had what some people call the first university in the world. It was in an area that had, of course, had Greek influence, the Gandharan area. It had the influence from the Persians, from the Achaemenid Empire that we've talked about before. So Takshila here in the northwest was a natural to have one of these great monuments. And I'm sure that they were supported in the old Indian fashion with villages that surrounded. It was certainly an area of great settlement, far more settlement than is there today. So when you come to a place like Nalanda and Takshila, I think that the significance of these places for the Buddhist tradition is that you had hundreds or even thousands of monastics living together, studying together, listening to lectures, debating, and that it's out of these places that the complexity of the Buddhist tradition, which we've seen in the previous lectures with all the philosophers, it is from places like this that developed. I just don't think that you can consider the complexity of the Buddhist teachings as coming from individual monks living in a forest or living by themselves, coming up with ideas and writing very complex texts about their thoughts. It wasn't that that was totally missing, but I think the crucial issue was when people got together in a sufficient number to really make a debate, a real debate, and a debate which represented the ideas and thoughts of a whole sphere of influence and cultural issues. Now, when Buddhism spread, one of the great sites for it was Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka. And Anuradhapura was about 4th century of the Common Era. So Anuradhapura was a long-lasting place. What you see here are the ruins, but up to the 11th century, that is, for hundreds of years, this large center was both a political center for kingdoms that rose and fell, but for the Buddhist tradition, it was a point at which, again, large numbers of monks would gather and be able to deal with the issues of this religious tradition and their interpretations, their commentaries, all of the issues which they dealt with, trying to figure out how to fit Buddhism into the current social and political issues of that place and that time, was being manufactured, so to speak, in places just like this. If we go back up to the Bay of Bengal, up to Bangladesh, we have a very interesting ruin at Gokul. When I first saw this a long time ago, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. It wasn't a stupa, that was obvious. It seemed to be a multi-storied living structure with rooms, and that's exactly what it is. You have to remember that this was built at a place that floods every year. The monsoon brings down the rain. The monsoon brings with it cyclones in the Bay of Bengal. Cyclones can cause storm surges to spread for miles inland. And so every year was a problem with water and the fact that there was flooding. I think that what we see here is that they simply built higher and higher. And if the water rose, they would just abandon for a period of time the lower floor, let it flood. What could you do? And move higher and higher up. So even at a place like this, we can see that these great centers were year-round. They dealt with the issues that were local, like floods, and they housed many monks, monastics, and those are the great monuments that relate to everything which is around them. Another one of the really great ancient sites was Vikramalashila. Vikramalashila takes us into a new era of Buddhism. At this point, we move farther on the calendar, and we're now into the 8th century. You can tell when you look here at Vikramalashila, enormous monument. But this monument today, which looks like it's just out in the field and you walk to it across the fields, was at the very center of settlements, villages, trade routes. So we have to study a place like this, not only for what went on here with the many monastics who lived here, but the supporting structure which allowed them to have such an enormous place. And many of the greatest minds of the Buddhist tradition for that period of time were here at one time or another. They sought its learning. It's hard to estimate exactly how many monastics they had at a given time, but probably in the area of 5,000. These were incredible collections of minds that were together, talking, debating, and dealing with the Buddhist tradition. No wonder the Buddhist doctrine became more and more precise and therefore more and more complex. Another one in that same region is Somapura. And again, you look at Somapura and it's around it is no longer any of the settlements, only the structure itself rising out of a field. And so you are apt to say, well, somehow there was this isolated place out there in the middle of the fields. My goodness, how did they ever do that? But that's today. This monument was again in the midst of a settlement of people with hundreds of surrounding villages, many of them owned by the institution and supporting it in that way. You can also see that it's tiered in an area where there's flooding. And I think that we can understand that these monuments, these great monasteries, these university monasteries, are what produced the Buddhism that we have today. If we move into Southeast Asia, then of course we come across a monument which is unexcelled, Borobudur in Java, Indonesia, still the world's largest Buddhist structure. It rises from the plain. It rises near a volcano. And at one time, it was covered with jungle, with the volcanic ash of centuries. And local people knew that there were these strange ruins. But when the Dutch came, they began to uncover it and reconstruct it. And we have now a very good example of what it must have been like. It was not in itself a place for people to live. It was a ritual structure. These terraces that you see, all of these you would circumambulate. And as you circumambulate and walked around each of the levels, they had more than a mile of very complex carvings of the stories of Buddhism for people to look at. So this, again, because it looks like it's out in the middle of nowhere, was supported by people who, again, had donated villages, great support. It needed the emperor. It had to get this much labor. This one is labor intensive like nothing else that you'll ever see in the Buddhist tradition. Not only was it huge, as you can see, but it was elaborately carved. Just the carving would have taken years of many hundreds of artisans. It was a place that had its content, in this case, in its structure. You can look at the stories that are carved around its walls and find exactly the Buddhist text that they were using as their content provider for what to carve next. So, for example, there is in the Avatamsaka Sutra, the wonderful story of the young man who goes out to seek for Buddhism, Sudana. And he goes to 52 different teachers. He gets taught by many different people. Sometimes sea captain gets taught by Maitreya Buddha. He gets taught by monastics, by beggars. His teachers are many. And you can follow his journey here at Borobudur. All of the 52 teachers are depicted here. So this monument was in many ways a teaching monument and still is. At about the same time, in the plain of the Irrawaddy River in Myanmar, was the kingdom of Bagan. And the kingdom of Bagan had its capital in this plain that you see here. And they were so devout and so tied to Buddhism that it wasn't just a monument, it was hundreds of monuments. And so when you go to Bagan, you realize that what you're looking at was the remains of a great great city in which the wealthy people who lived there because of all the trade up the river that tied them to the maritime trade, on their property, it seems, they built their individual stupas, revering the Buddha. And it just stretches away toward the horizon. So this is 8th century once again, and we can see the power of the Buddhist tradition to be able to build something this many stupas was an indication of an enormous Buddhist community that was there and dealing with issues. Then we go to a place which has only recently been uncovered, Jagat-dala. And Jagat-dala takes us a bit later. Some people say that it's all the way to the 11th century. But once again, we see a huge monument. So I'm becoming repetitive with each one of these, but I like you to just look at them and think about what could have been behind having such structures, many of them now just left out in jungles, in open fields, but once part of great settlements of people. In Sri Lanka, in the 11th century, at about the time of Jagat-dala, Polonnaruwa in Sri Lanka became an enormous monument. I think these are the most impressive ruins that I've ever seen. I love this site. It's I like it better than the more famous Anuradhapura. I am so impressed with the fact that you could have out of brick these incredible structures which have lasted. But imagine what it was like when they were the site of what was going on in Buddhism. And here in Sri Lanka, we know that the big issues were sometimes between whether they were going to be Mahayana or whether they would be early Buddhism. Sometimes it was tantric even in its practices. And these remains and ruins are not the result of a whole collapse of culture around them, but simply a reminder that these great places, no matter if you build it out of brick, after many centuries, they become ruins. They just do. If we move over to Cambodia, we come not so much to a Buddhist monument as to a great city, perhaps at one time the largest city in the world. The only thing that's left of this city is the downtown, which was this temple complex, which had both Buddhist and Hindu origin. In other words, from this one, we can see that the Buddhist and the Brahmanic tradition existed side by side, and that the structures and the monuments which were built show that out there in Southeast Asia, people didn't make such a clear distinction between Brahmanism and Buddhism. But so I don't know if it was Brahmanic Buddhism or whether you could say it was Buddhist Brahmanism. They were so intertwined. I love the fact that the tree roots have grown over these buildings. They can't take them away. The tree roots are holding up the structures these days. And it's a fascinating place. When they started using ground penetrating radar, LIDAR, they found out that there were outlines of city streets and farms and roads and canals that had a 60-mile stretch across this plain. And this was what was in the middle of it. So if you really want to see what can happen to a place over time that transforms it, Angkor Wat is a must that you should visit if you possibly can. Then we go to Thailand and we have the ruins of Ayutthaya. Now, Ayutthaya was, again, later, 14th to the 18th century. Many of the places which I have shown you that were existing, for example, up to the 11th and 12th centuries, they were destroyed, a lot of them, or at least damaged severely by the invasion of Islamic invaders that came into Northwest and came through northern India and destroyed them. Ayutthaya also was often under attack, not so much from just, they were under attack from the people over at Bagan and Myanmar. And eventually the capital was abandoned and they moved to what's now Bangkok. But again, these places, which were so huge, were the basic areas where the reformed Theravada tradition that we have today was being constructed by the many monastics who lived in these places. So whether we're looking in the Bangladesh floodplains where the Buddhist ancient sites rise above the floodwaters, or whether we look at the tiered structures and walls that were set up for these great monastic centers, we have these monuments before us. So how do you study them? I began to almost despair. I can't think how in the world to study everything which happened in the great circle of Buddhism. What was the role of each of these great monuments, these great settlements, these huge communities of monastics? So, to my great surprise, I want to share with you an idea I have, and I hope that you will challenge me on it, or at least give thought to it. I have come to the conclusion that in order to study the great circle of Buddhism in all its complexity and all its shifts, and the fact that there was no place which was in control of it, and yet within this vast area of the great circle of Buddhism, there was a maintenance of the Buddhist tradition it didn't just fly off into chaos. And the question is, how do you study a place which is so complex? Well, I was reading what's happened in the computer industry. The question is how to study or how to construct software where you have such complexity and yet where you have no fixed data in a way, because everything is changing all the time. I mentioned to you about the chain block idea. Blocks that reproduce the content of the previous block plus tell you when the change was made. That's what cryptocurrency is. But what the computer people have done is to look to see if they could find a model for studying the complexity of how to build the future computational artificial intelligence information. And they've come to the conclusion that nature provides us with an incredibly efficient and surprising model for dealing with changes. And that's our immune system. So that what the computer people today are doing is trying to construct an artificial immune system within their software. And this is a way to have a method of seeing how things develop, making and retaining memory, but doing it with the least amount of effort. As we know, chain block and cryptocurrency requires enormous computing power. So how can you have the memory preserved without all that electricity and effort being required? And so they've turned to the body and to the immune system to see if they can discover that nature itself has been able to maintain incredible amount of memory, using up the least amount of energy. And so we should look at it. Our immune system is like another brain. It has memory. And we need to jog that memory. And all of us are getting these jogs. We're going to get our booster shots, and we're taking our all the material that we have to do for COVID. And what we're trying to do is to help the immune system's memory. That's all we're doing. We're trying to keep that memory from fading, because if the memory fades, then the immune system would not recognize that what's coming into the body doesn't belong there. So when we think about Buddhism spreading, one of the things is that it had, as it spread, it had to maintain in some fashion a memory which said, this is Buddhist and this is not. And how do you do that? Well, the immune system produces two kinds of cells that can hold memory and can function to try to keep the changes from being destructive when other viruses come into our body. Part of these cells are produced in the bone, and they migrate to the thymus gland, and they become what we have, the antibodies in our lymph nodes that protect us. In other words, the immune system has developed a way of dealing with change, daily change, change every moment. And it has built a way to protect itself from the viruses that can infect it. No wonder the computer scientists are saying we want to look carefully at the immune system because we have all these virus attacks. We all have these, we have to subscribe to protections that come in and try to protect our computer systems from invasion. But we still don't do as good a job as the immune system. The immune system has developed a way to do this, and so it's efficient. It doesn't take a huge maintenance to preserve it. And I think that the same thing was true for Buddhism, that as Buddhism spread, it had to be something like the immune system in terms of maintenance of the memory of the tradition, the ability to exclude those things which were not Buddhist or which were against the tradition, and yet not have it be an incredibly expensive and onerous task. So in the body, the immune system creates a T cell, and when the cancer cell comes along, it has the memory to recognize that, and it resists it, it destroys it. And our very life depends on this. So how is that memory preserved? How is it that that T cell can, without taking over the whole of the body, and so we have just one big T cell? B cells primarily are structured from the thymus, and the B cells, when they are attacked, as you can see in the picture, you'll see the squiggly lines. Here comes an attack. Here comes something which shouldn't be there. The B cells have those little projections. Those projections ward off. They don't allow the intruder to enter into the cell. They produce antibodies that fight it off. So what was there in the Buddhist tradition as it spread that they were coming in contact with local traditions all the time, particularly shamanic and other issues? How can you deal with that, the fact that you've suddenly moved from one culture to another, and they have their own religious historical background? You go to China and you have Taoism and you have Confucianism. And how does it that Buddhism was able to find a way to deal with and still maintain its existence? And it's not just by totally pushing everything out. You can't do that. You have to develop some way, as we know with these T cells and the immune system and the B cells, in the immune system, the immune system allows change. And it allows those things in which sometimes cause mutations, but it has a memory for those things which cause illness, which cause destruction of cells. That's to be what the Buddhist tradition had to do when it went into a place like China. It had to allow the Chinese issues to come in. It had to become partly Taoist. It had to become partly Confucian. It had to accept the importance of filial piety. It had to accept the notion of how transmission occurred through the family. It had to accept that because otherwise there would have been no audience. And yet at the same time, it had an ability to be able to maintain its structure and its system by determining which issues had to be rejected and which issues could be accepted because they would not destroy the Buddhist tradition. So what I've been trying to do in this lecture is just to say, I'm looking for a model. I'm looking for a way to study how Buddhism could allow itself to be informed by all kinds of cultural traditions, how it could move for thousands of miles, how it could maintain its memory of what was important and true to Buddhism. And it had to maintain that memory of everything changes. There's nothing which is a self that is permanent and unchanging. And it had to maintain that memory. But at the same time, it could allow for filial piety. It could allow for feeding the ancestors. It could allow for a lot of things so long as the memory was looking for anything which destroyed this idea of impermanence and no self, emptiness, if you will. And so long as the system, the circulatory lymph circulation system of Buddhism allowed it to still survive with those things intact, then it could adapt, change, just as it's doing today in the modern world. We are faced with coming to grips with the enormous changes that Buddhism and the rest of us face every day. We have to deal with a world which is digital. We have had to deal with the world that had a pandemic, still in it. We are always in this situation. Buddhism has been in it forever. And looking for a model to understand how, number one, it may try to respond in the future in the way that is least destructive, that is the most economical, takes the least amount of energy and power and time. Maybe we, like the computer engineers, can turn our attention to what the body has long ago produced for us the immune system. And maybe that's what Buddhism has been in the Great Circle. It has been able to create for itself an immune system that allowed it to exist, to thrive, to continue, and not be destroyed by change and newness and shift of time and place. So thank you very much.